We're going to continue on our journey looking at the path to a new primer and the steps that are needed to get to our end destination of new readers. And so some of those things that we'll be looking at will be including to count the cost. What is it going to cost to develop a primer and to get it to printing and then into use in the classrooms? And then the second thing we're going to look at is going to consider the context for the primer. How will it be used and by whom will it be used? Looking at initial work agreement, basically a partnership agreement between LEI and whoever's requesting the primer. The advanced preparations that need to be done before LEI consultants arrive to help develop the draft of the primer. Primer workshop itself, where the draft will be developed of the 82 lessons. And then the final, the printing the primer and the celebration that goes with that. So in developing a primer, the minimum time to develop a primer from the time LEI is first contacted is probably four to 6 months. Average is 1 year. And so that includes the advanced preparations that need to be done, which can take up to 1 to 5 months, depending on the team that's working on them. You have then the primer workshop itself, where the lessons of the primer are written and drafted, and then the checking of those draft and the manuscript lessons. And we allocate usually 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the primer and where it is and the type of language it is. Then we have the desktop publishing and the follow-up checking and testing. And this usually takes a minimum of 1 month to do just because of all of the detail involved. And this cycle goes around and round and round as often as is needed until everyone is satisfied that we have the best draft possible. And then it goes on for printing. And then once the primer is printed, the initial printing, then you can have a launch and initial teacher training. So anyway, so average of up to 1 year for all of these steps. The first thing we're going to look at is counting the cost. So looking at the primer budget, you have as part of your downloadable materials a template for a primer project budget, which you just look at some of those categories. These amounts have been developed by a colleague in Ghana, so these would be Ghanaian prices, but a group would put in the prices that are appropriate for their location. So the first thing we have is the advanced preparation work, the translation of the documents, the language data worksheet, and other things. There's approximately 200 pages of materials that need to be prepared before the primer team gets together or the LEI consultants come. And this can often run about $212 US. Another area you can consider lodging. We're going to be looking at later what are good locations for primer workshop. And so you can consider where that's going to be. Translators or how many local writers will be on the team. Figure for 2 LEI staff and maybe one other person to help out. So in this case, 1277 times 5 people times 15 days for a total of $958. So what are the meals for this breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or just lunch? Just how that goes, then whatever monetary value that is. In this case, is approximated $767. We're going to work as a cost in writing, whatever that is, times 15 days. Then you're also going to look at stationery, what we need for pencils, 4 sheets, newsprint sheets, printer, all those kinds of things will go into the primer workshop. Travel, how will your team inviting bus taxi fare for them, and also for the LEI consultants for from the view, $171, and then honorarium for your local team if you plan to give them one, and then contingency fund. So the workshop itself, including the advanced preparation, is about a little over $3,000, as you can see there. The thing vary can go down depending on your local context and the arrangements you make. Is the initial printing of the primers. Once we've gone through that cycle of checking and the typesetters, this is approximate, depends on the language, but 2 books, a total of about 200 pages, $5 per page. So setting would be about $1,000. Initial 500 copies of each book, 1,000 copies, $2 per book. The initial printing of the primers, $50,000. We recommend you don't print too many in the initial printing, print like 10,000, because if you find mistakes in those early passes, then it's hard to go back and make those changes. For our total primer budget, so we have the primer workshop, we have the initial printing we talked about, and then you might want to have a special launch of the primer for maybe $500, and the first training workshop, depending on how many teachers you have, how that's being organized, could run $1,000. So the total project is about $8,330 for that initial development and initial printing of material, initial launch of it. So cost. Then the next thing we want to look is considering the context. Where are these primers going to be used? Who's going to be using them? So we want to look at what are the literacy needs in the area. Most times, if there's people wanting to develop local language literacy, then there's a strong literacy need. But what is it? What scriptures in print for that language group? Are there any other literacy materials already available? Sometimes there are, and these can be useful in developing a Bible content literacy materials. Or they can, sometimes we might suggest that they go ahead and use what's already available rather than spending $10,000 to develop materials. Who will be the literacy ministry coordinator? This is a very important question because you need somebody who's designated to be the contact person for LEI, so that we have one person to go back and forth with, but also who's going to be the person that organizes the trainings and the dispersal of materials and things for that local literacy primer. And how will the primer workshop and printing be funded? We'll be talking a little bit more about this in a few minutes. So where's the language primarily spoken? This is another thing to consider. Is it a rural setting where most of the language speakers are in a rural area? Or is it in an urban area? Maybe working with a slum area or street boys or something like that, but yet it's in a more urban context. Or it may be that the language group crosses both, and so these will affect how you develop stories for the primer later on. Also, where's the religious context? What's the religious context? Is it Christian? Are you going to be primarily working with non-readers within the church context? And then in that case, a Protestant, Catholic, or some other group? And we've had problems, situations with this before where the Catholics had one version of the Bible and the Protestants had another, and they spelled things differently. So we had to consider how to best incorporate that into the primer. Also, is the main people group that you're going to be teaching to read and write, are they Muslim? And is it a fanatical Muslim group, or is it just kind of a nominal Muslim group? And we'll talk about why this matters in a little bit. Are they Hindu, or are they animist, or are they other Buddhist if you're in another section of the world? And this can affect some of the content of the primer. So the context affects our choice sometimes of a health or farming stories and Bible stories for translation for the advanced preparation. So that's why we want to think about these things ahead of time, because it can affect what is done in preparation for the primer workshop. So in terms of Bible stories, our usual Bible stories are 13 Old Testament and 23 New Testament stories. And that would be just the normal thing. But sometimes if you're in a strong Muslim context, possibly you would want to use just our 23 Old Testament stories and not have any New Testament stories in the first two books, but maybe have a third book for the New Testament, 23 New Testament stories. But this would add some additional stories and additional time to get those lessons prepared. And also, depending on the religious context, like I said, can affect the introduction of Bible content during the workshop. We think about the health topics. What of our health topics are needed for the group? Are there some that aren't needed? Or if it's going to be a mostly urban area, or do we even interested in farming stories? So these are things to ask. One thing to remember is that for LEI to assist a group, we must have some Bible content in the primer. So we've had groups before that said we want a primer, we like the method, but we don't want any Bible content because of our situation. And in that case, we've had to pass because we want some kind of Bible content. But we're willing to work with groups to how that looks and how that happens. So when a group initially contacts LEI and wants to develop a primer, we also send out an initial work agreement. And this just gets some of the particulars of contact information and what language, and just a reminder that there must be some scripture in print in the target language for LEI to work with the group. And so this partnership agreement essentially outlines the responsibilities of the sponsoring group and then what LEI will also agree to. So one is the sponsoring group invites LEI in writing. This is the initial work agreement basically, to come and do a primer in their language. And then LEI coordinates with the sponsoring group to develop a mutually convenient time for the primer workshop. So LEI will then send the advanced preparation packet, and then sponsoring group assigns someone or someones to complete the information that's there, the translations and the filling in the information. The sponsoring group is to recruit local language speakers to be on the primer instruction to work with our class. And then once we arrive for the primer workshop, the LEI consultant directs and assists the work of a primer construction team. The sponsoring group will provide the cost of the local primer construction team, room and board and transportation costs in country for LEI consultant, and materials like the stationary materials and those kinds of things, computers, printers, needed by the primer construction team. LEI will provide transportation costs between North America and the country for LEI consultants. If a LEI consultant is coming from a country near the other country, it's a local group that's going to be going, then often we ask the sponsoring group to help pay for their transportation costs from their country to the construction workshop. The sponsoring group does arrange for funding for the printing of the complete primer series, and like all books to be printed at the same time if they're available. And LEI will provide the desktop publishing, the type primer copies for checking and correcting, and the finalized camera copy. If you remember from our budget, this is a savings of about $1,000. Then the sponsoring group agrees to make primers available to all groups at a reasonable cost in the area. So maybe there's some other groups that want to do literacy and materials. So it's not this is ours, we can't use it. But to make them available, not that exorbitant cost. And LEI agrees to do some follow-up tutor training for future revision help. Reminder that our LEI consultants ask for no honorarium or reimbursement as consultants. If they were working in a secular environment, they often might get several $1,000s for their time. But this is our service to the Lord and to you and to the sponsoring group. And so we only ask for room, board, and transportation within the country for our consultants. So all arrangements will be made through the LEI regional director for that area. We want a definite commitment made in writing, invitation in writing, and this often is the initial work agreement plus then letters of invitation for visas and such. And then LAI will send the advanced preparation packet. We want assurance in writing that all preparatory work will be completed before the arrival of the LAI team, and then confirmation of when it's complete. And then send assurance in writing that the local team is committed for the dates arranged and that all in-country travel, room, and board will be prepared for LAI personnel. So these are some of those initial steps, considering counting the cost, considering the context and the initial work agreement. And in the next video, we'll be looking at some of the advanced preparations that are needed.